Welcome back. This is part 3 of my talk on art style, art direction in video games. If you're coming in here, I recommend you go back to part 1 and start there. You might be a little lost. So we're talking about how, at least how I like to look at inspiration and reference in other video games too, and interpret what's working, what's not. And in a way, making art is filtering, taking in, and regurgitating. And that's not a particularly appetizing way of describing the artistic process. So I borrowed Jesse Schell's lenses wording instead, but take your pick. If you take any of these artistic media I've shown up here, film, comics, games, you can break them down into stylistic elements, which is sort of what I've half-assedly tried to do here. And I'm not talking about how movies are made or how games are made. I'm talking about when you see that final image on the screen, what do you see? What are the elements on the screen that make up the style? Games have some overlap, but they break down differently from other media. For example, in comics and film, the composition or the layout or staging is of critical importance. This is why storyboards are such a powerful tool. But with games, that element of composition is almost always under the player's control because they wield the camera. And so we can't consider it a dominant stylistic element for games. So let's look at what is important for games. The way modeling or sculpting affects the final rendered frame is only in two specific ways: the silhouette of objects or cast shadows that are created by those objects. Game artists often have a choice about whether to model something like a brick or paint it into a texture, and the difference is in silhouette and shadow. Kinds of shapes that show up in silhouettes and shadows have a big impact on style. Look at Mario Galaxy again. Pretty much everything is round, but also squashed and stretched most of the time, as if the geometry is pliable or rubbery. Look at Gears of War. There are lots of rectangular forms, softened at the top corners, with chips missing, like weathered bricks. And the same goes for the characters. Game characters need especially strong silhouettes because you're often judging them at a distance, under time pressure from gameplay. Good guy, bad guy, what's this character about? What's his story? Try and pick that out from a silhouette that's 20 pixels high. Game artists and game concept artists spend a lot of time on character silhouettes. When it comes to texturing, it breaks down into two specific things. The textures on objects give them color and define how detailed they appear in the final rendered frame. Color first. Color is extremely powerful in setting a tone. And I think this is one area where we can do a lot better as game developers. It gets challenging when you've got a lot of different artists coming together to make a game, and when you're reusing objects all over the place. Yet, when a game comes out with a deliberate, carefully considered color palette, it's perhaps the most important stylistic element. And to revisit our history, in the NES days, the hardware also enforced limited color palettes. And in many ways, this was an aesthetic strength. In my opinion, it's where a lot of the retro appeal for these games comes from. You can see evidence in this in the ability to nearly eliminate the pattern of the pixel art and still remain with recognizable characters purely based on palette arrangements. Probably know what you're looking at here. Another example is the demake experiments that have been popular recently, where you take a modern game, reimagine it as they might have been in an early console like the NES. The modern games with strong color choices are the ones that make for great pixel art. This is the color palette for Team Fortress 2. It's got a strong color palette, makes for a great demake. I'm talking about detail. Detail is of special consideration in games because players direct themselves. We don't have that compositional tool I was talking about before to direct the player's eye. So we can use detail or the lack of detail as a surrogate. A lot of artists will go and try and detail everything in the game world, so if the player walks up to it, you know, it looks like there's something realistic feeling there. But sometimes that works to a disadvantage because it's not interactive and it's not important. I worked in MMOs for a long time, and I remember when EverQuest 2 was coming out. World of Warcraft was coming out around the same time. And EverQuest 2 and MMO developers like myself, we ran up against this. There's so much going on in an MMO, and we just were heavily constrained on what we could push as far as detail. On EQ2, the artist sliced up the outfits and put tiling textures across them to get more and more detail out of it. And WoW sort of took the opposite approach. They sort of embraced the fact that their textures were going to be blurry and used their studio art style and came up with something that works for their game. Now, if you walk up to a brick wall in one of these games and you take a screenshot of it, EverQuest 2 might look a little bit better. But when you consider the experience as a whole, and WoW, you stop looking at individual bricks, you take in the whole world as one. And I think it works to their advantage. If you can deliver a style consistently, it becomes its own internal reality. It casts a magic spell on you, so to speak. Here is color and detail together. This is, I think his name is Kazuo Oga. He's a background painter on many of the Studio Ghibli films. And his whole job is to paint the stuff that you're not supposed to pay pure attention to. Let the characters in the story sit on top of it. And so he uses color and selective detail to suggest excuse me, to suggest texture. Look at this rock. It's brush strokes, but it suggests the texture of a rock. Compare this rock in Crisis. It's got lots of detail, but you know, which rock is better for your game? More of awesome Ghibli backgrounds. This stuff is incredible inspiration. Now if you combine silhouette with color, this is Dermot Power's amazing concept art, which is essentially shapes and colors. You know, it's silhouette and color. There's not a lot of lighting, there's not a lot of detail, there's suggested detail. But he comes up with incredible character designs this way that, you know, and he's drawing what's most important to the character design and leaving the rest out. Lighting is creating areas of light and shadow to create contrast, draw the eye, and it's one of the things that's actually it's pretty much the same across all media, from painting to photography. I read this book, Painting with Light by John Alton, recently, and it predates video games, but everything in it is totally applicable. Shading is how surfaces react to lighting. The best example I could think of how this plays a role in style is Battlefield games, of which I'm a massive fan. Here you've got Battlefield 1942 and Battlefield 3. The shapes The characters are pretty similar. The color palette, it's pretty similar. The lighting is improved, but the major differences in my mind are in shading. There's ambient occlusion shaders, atmosphere, Fresnel on the cloth, and lots of other things that get technical, but when programmers are developing these things and developing the look, artists play a big role in defining that look through shading. The fundamental challenge of animation in games is that the player wants to press a button and see an action result immediately. So there's this problem with anticipation not being there, momentum. You run around with the character in a game, you change directions, they snap to the new direction because you as a player need that, but it doesn't have momentum and weight. One thing that we do better in games every year is use simulation and AI to build better procedural animations. Blending of IK, leaning, parametric animation, behavior graphs to drive the animations and the transitions, physics, biometric stuff, all this kind of junk. This stuff feels good to the player because it's honest and it's natural in the game world. Backbreaker sort of took this to an extreme for football. And Tsunomori Dreams takes it about as far as you can go.
Do anything. How's there, why are you putting the mouse?
You know what? I'm not going to play their video in here. I'm going to link to it. Go check out the Yogcast. It's hilarious. This game is insane. The entire physical nature of the movement in the game is simulated. There's no keyframed motion or motion capture. Notice the characters are getting more and more stylized as we go. But you might say that this game has no art style, or that the programmer art hurts it, but I think that the animation is so authentic feeling because of all the technical work that went into it. It's actually incredibly stylish and hilarious. Exposure is a relatively new thing in video games as we get better and better at simulating cameras, but it's very important. Earlier I said that pixel art was like painting a canvas with Legos. Well, building a game world these days in 3D games, sort of like building a little diorama world from scratch and then photographing it. This is the work of Kim Kiever, where she does exactly that in fish tanks and injects atmosphere and photographs it. And I think it's a great analog to what we do as world builders in video games. Also, like photography and like real cameras, there are bad cameras and there are good cameras. And there's things like, there's a lot of technical stuff that goes into having a good camera in your game. Also, like photography, there's work to be done on the image that comes from the camera to make it look its best. In some cases, added layer stylization, film treatment, exposure correction, post effects, and color grading. To me, all these aspects of exposure are about creating a feeling or a tone. To me, we do that by simulating the eye. And my best way of explaining this is to think about the sun. The sunlight is warm on your face. If you stare at the sun, it physically hurts your eye. And there are photographic tricks that have sort of come through with cameras like lens flares and things like that, and bloom, that help remind us of that feeling that we get from a real eyeball. Another example is When you go outside in the moonlight and you look around, you get a sense that it's blue. Well, moonlight isn't blue. The moon is gray. The sun is sort of yellow. The light coming off the moon is not so strongly blue. It's not blue at all, I don't think. I might be corrected on this. What I remember is that it's the way that your eyes perceive low light lends you to believe that moonlight is blue. So we go and we color grade night shots to be blue. In video games, we try and fake all this stuff to create the right feeling and the right tone. If you put all these elements together, you have a style. Now, if you were to draw some conclusions from all this, it's that game art is nothing special without that real-time rendering technology that enables it, or the gameplay that makes it matter. It can get depressing as a game artist sometimes to get a sense for all these constraints. And, basically this whole presentation is just me bitching about all the things I'm not allowed to do as a game artist. All the cool ideas get ruined by, technology and players. But of course, the reality is that interactivity is what makes game art great. Everything I've said so far is theory. In practice, when you set out to make a game, you don't have your technology, you don't have your gameplay, the final gameplay. Game development is a process of discovery. And at Bethesda Game Studios, we have this saying, great games are played, not made. And that means you can talk and design in the air all you want, but you don't know anything about what your game is going to be until you play it. So it'd be a mistake to sit down and paint a bunch of concept art and say, this is the art style for our game, and be done. Just by building gameplay and technology, art styles need to be discovered through iteration, trial, and error. Here's some great examples of early screenshots for landmark, beautiful games and how they turned out. It's pretty rare to see these kinds of screenshots released, but it's not so rare to go through this when you're making a game. Games are supremely malleable. In theory, you could change the main character of your game, the entire look of them, the entire character design, on the last day of development. You could swap them out. Everything would still work. There's no other media where you could do that in the last 1% or less of making something. But you can't get great art direction through pure random experimentation. Everything I've been talking about is how you should be planning for a strong art style. Often artists will just say our game's going to be incredibly realistic, or stylized, or God forbid cel-shaded, and that's just a recipe for blandness at best. You should make something bold and stylish and make it work by aligning the art style with great gameplay and technology. So I talked about pixels, triangles of style, landscapes of inspiration, lenses of game art, and I want to finish up with some vector plots of art direction. There are a lot of artists working on the average game, and it's to everyone's benefit to get those artists thinking expressively, being creative. You won't get any art style if you reduce art production to a mechanical pipeline. But on the other hand, you've got to get those artists working together. Without consistency in the art, you don't have a style. So here's how I think about it. It's like each artist is a vector. If they're all going in different directions, they sum to nothing. But if you can get them oriented, which is difficult given the sort of intangible, touchy-feely nature of artistic expression, but if you can do it, those vectors will sum to a strong single force. These vectors are what I see in my head when I hear the term art direction. If you can get everything in your game sharing a style, and that style vector aligns with your gameplay vector and your technology vector, then you've created a world, an internally consistent reality that allows players to immerse themselves, and that is going to make for an amazing experience. And so that's the talk. I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to get in touch, give me some comments, and thanks for listening.